Hello, greetings everybody. Slightly different look of video today, isn't it? Because you're not going to see my face in it because I haven't quite mastered mashing up two videos together, so you have my face in the corner and so on. No doubt that will happen in years to come. This I'm going to focus on tackling the source question in the Edexcel A-level South Africa paper module. And there's basically really with the source question, the key you're combining two things, two skills, which is the source analysis with your own knowledge. And so really what you've got to do is, if you like, evaluate, assess the source. That's one thing, but using your own knowledge to do that. And a lot of people tend to just do one or the other, and that's generally where people usually will fall down on the source question. Is either they'll see the topic of the question and think, oh, I know all about that, and basically just write an essay about it with barely any reference to the source, which I think if you do that, I'd have to double check the mark scheme. I think you're going to be capped at something like level 2 or something out of 5 levels. You can't write a good answer, obviously, to a question about the sources without barely referencing the sources. So that's one common mistake, and it's such a shame because people write brilliant essays that might get full marks if they were the essay question, but they're not, they're the source question. So maybe they get about 10 or 12 tops. The other mistake people make is to write all about the sources without their own knowledge at all. And if you do this really well, you can probably do slightly better than you could the other way around, but it's still, to really make a full evaluation and assessment of the sources, you need to know a bit about the context, and you need to write a bit about the context, and you need to bring in knowledge that either supports or challenges the claims being made in the source to fully evaluate them. So remember, it's about combining those two things. It's about using your knowledge to assess and evaluate the source. Okay, and within that, you've got to kind of focus when I say the source. The question is about how you can use two sources together. That's how they always start. We'll look at the phrasing in a moment. How you can use, how a historian of a particular topic could use these sources together. So often one source will kind of fill in the gaps of the other. I think I'm right in saying always, or let's be cautious and say generally or nearly always, they'll be from two different perspectives. Typically there might be a National Party politician in one source and, an ANC member in another source, for example. Sorry, let me turn this off. Sorry. Okay, so right, let's jump in. I've lost my thread there. Let's jump in, shall we? So here is a paper from June 2023. So this is last year's paper. I'm not sure this is available for you online. I'll try and put a link to all the past papers. The best way to revise is just to look at as many past papers as possible. And I suggest the best way is to make detailed plans of how you would answer as many past questions as possible. And I always suggest do as much as you can on a question, on a plan, just brainstorming, just purely from memory. And only then, when you've exhausted your memory banks, only then go to your notes, to your books and so on to kind of fill in any gaps. I think that's the most efficient way of revising. Because you're really, by the time you get to your notes and your books, you're really laser focused on the information that you need, and you're not wasting a lot of time just kind of reading through stuff passively. Okay, so here we go. Without further ado, here is the paper. Let's open it up. Let's imagine we're right in the exam now. We're freaking out. Here we go. About one person in each class each year, at least in the mocks, in my experience, will answer the question. There are sets of questions on India and questions on South Africa. Now, people doing South Africa obviously spent the whole year studying South Africa, but for some reason, on average, about one student a year will freak out. They'll see, oh, India. How far could the historian use these sources to investigate the failure of the Simla conference? I don't know anything about that. I'll just give it my best shot. And they won't realize that actually the question is, you can choose either question 1 or question 2. My advice to you is if you've spent the year studying South Africa, answer the question on South Africa. It would be much preferable if they just had if they issued two separate papers, one for those doing India, one for those doing South Africa. For whatever reasons, maybe the exam boards are cheapskates, they mush them together, and your first job is to ignore all the questions on India. In fact, I'm going to even just strike it out there. We're not doing any of the questions on India. Okay, so let's have a look. Study sources 3 and 4 in the sources booklet before you answer this question. That's good advice. However, I would always read the question before I look at the sources, because then again, like with the revision technique, then you can be laser focused on what am I looking for? What am I looking for information about? So what is the question? How far could the historian make use of sources 3 and 4 together? Now that's how all of the questions are going to start, like that. How far could the historian make uses of sources 3 and 4 together? They all start like that. And it's interesting. So it's how far could the historian make use of these sources together? So the old papers, sometimes they used to say, how much use is it? But this is not how much use it is. How far could the historian make use of them? So you're looking for ways in which they could be useful, ways that they could shed light on on different aspects of the topic. But you're also looking for any limitation. There's something we should be wary of about putting too much weight on a particular source if it's, coming from someone who's got a particular political agenda, who might have an interest in exaggerating or downplaying certain elements and so on. And generally they always will. Generally, always, at least one of the sources will be from someone who's got a very clear political agenda, which doesn't mean the source is useless. It's always useful. In fact, someone could be the most biased, source possible. It's still useful for showing how that person or that organization seek to present that issue. In fact, it's probably the best source you can get for showing that. So never dismiss a source. They'll only ever give you useful sources. Yeah, so never say, oh, this source is not very useful. They only give you useful sources, but there will always be some things to be wary of, some limitations to point out. Okay, so what's the topic of this? How far could the historian make use of sources 3 and 4 together to investigate, and I'm going to underline key bits of this bit, to investigate the importance of F.W. de Klerk, okay, in the process of dismantling apartheid in 1990. Okay, so those are things we're looking out for. So when we go to the sources, we're going to be looking for, is there anything that either explicitly or implicitly says or suggests something about de Klerk's importance in dismantling apartheid and in 1990, right? It tells us about something in 1992 or whatever, that's not relevant. What was his importance in the process of dismantling apartheid in 1990? So when we go to the sources now, we're going to be razor focused on looking for anything that tells or even suggests anything we could deduce or infer from what's been said in the source about the importance of de Klerk in the process of dismantling apartheid in 1990. That's what we're looking for. And of course, there's always two things you're kind of assessing. You're assessing the content of the source and looking out for information about this that you're going to assess in the content of the source. That is what the source says. But you're also going to look, is there anything that makes this source particularly useful given what the source is? That is the provenance, who wrote it, when, why, blah, 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 all that stuff. Okay, your W questions. Okay, so here we go. Again, first thing is not to freak out. Oh my God, this is all about the Simla conference. We're not looking at source 1. We're not looking at source 2. We're just going to, let's strike those out. We're not interested. Sorry, Gandhi. Sorry, Viceroy Wavell. We're not dealing with you right now. We're going to flip. It's always sources 3 and 4 for South Africa. So we're going to flip to them. And straight away, there's two things that I suggest that you do in answering these questions before you start writing. And I know what it's like. There's high pressure, it's exam, it's limited time. You want to start writing your answer as soon as possible. But you need to spend time on two things I would do is kind of annotate and almost code the document. And I'll show you what I mean by this. coding the document, kind of, yeah. Well, I'll show you what I mean. We'll do it together right now. So, and it's worth spending, I would say, 10, even 15 minutes on this. Remember, you've got 45 minutes to do the source question. You should spend generally equal time on the source question as on the essay question. You might get away. Maybe you might want to spend 50 minutes on the source question and 40 minutes on the essay, but really your aim should be equal time because they've got equal marks attached to them. So let's take it that we've got 45 minutes for the question. Of those 45 minutes, I would spend up to a third of the time, not even writing, just reading, annotating, coding the sources. At least give yourself at least 5 minutes for each of the sources, 10 minutes in total. But if you need to spend up to 15 minutes on it, do it. It's time well spent. Okay, let's have a look. Source 3. So and I'm going to underline anything that could be useful for investigating this issue of the importance of de Klerk in dismantling apartheid. So this source is from F.W. de Klerk. Okay, so straight away, it's going to be useful, right? We've been asked about the importance of de Klerk. Well, de Klerk's going to be quite well informed about de Klerk, isn't he? He is de Klerk. Don't know how much more informed you could be. I know the psychotherapists tell us that the average person knows more about you after meeting you for 5 minutes than you know about yourself. But be that aside, he probably knows what he did, why he did it, and so on better than anyone else. So if you can't see that there, I've just written well informed. So I'm just going to kind of, as I go through, I'm going to underline key points, and anything that occurs to me, I'm going to kind of just put a note next to them. Okay, so as the book's called The Last Trek, A New Beginning. That's interesting, The Last Trek. Pause the video here. What's he referencing there, this trek? Pause the video so you can remember. That's right, the Great Trek, of course, of the 1830s. And he's saying a new beginning, the last trek. So it's interesting. We may or may not want to comment on this. Obviously, we've got limited time. We can't comment on every little thing. But I think it's just interesting, isn't it, that he's called his book The Last Trek. So he's suggesting in that title a certain significance, that this is somehow marking, sort of bookending this period of sort of Afrikaner nationalism, white supremacy, and so on. That in some senses, for the Afrikaners at least, obviously white supremacy began before the Great Trek, but this period of Afrikaner nationalism beginning with the Great Trek in the 1830s, this is kind of the other end of that historical moment. So he's suggesting that this is significant, that he is significant, that what he did, or his time at least in power, marked a kind of end of this over 150 years of Afrikaner nationalist history, and marked a new chapter, a new beginning of something else. I just thought I'd make that comment. I'm not going to annotate it because I think probably we're going to have enough to say without delving into that. But those are some of the points you could make. Right, it's his autobiography. Okay, so that could be good and bad. And what I'm going to do, here's my coding, I'm going to kind of do a tick if I think, if for the provenance stuff, tick if something makes something useful. I'm going to put a cross if there's reasons to be wary of it. Now, again, tick for the same reasons. You know, he's well informed. He's writing about his own life. He knows his own life. He lived it. But at the same time, I'm also going to put a cross. Can you think why we should be wary or a bit limited? There might be a limitation of relying too heavily on an autobiography. Just pause again and see what you can think. See what you think about that. I mean, so I would say, you know, he probably wants to sell the book, and he probably wants to justify and possibly exaggerate his own position. And a book like this, you know, it's not a law court where he's got to be precisely accurate and so on. It's kind of mass entertainment in a sense. So he might oversimplify events. You may or may not be able to read my writing here. I'm just writing mass entertainment, oversimplify, and put question mark because I'm gonna not be too categorical, saying, oh, he's definitely gonna oversimplify everything. This will be oversimplified. Try and be a bit nuanced when you make these claims. He may use terms like that. He may oversimplify things. He might over-dramatize things to sort of make them seem more dramatic than they really were. Oh, this was, the tensions were running high. You could feel the crackle in the, whatever. To make it readable, right? And to sell copies and so on. And he may want to exaggerate his own importance as well. Might want to give himself a bit of an ego boost by writing this book. So again, I'm going to put a question mark to remind me when I come to write up these points. I'm going to use words like may. He may want to exaggerate his own importance, etc. Okay, what else is published in 1998? So what again? I think there are pros and cons. Now, something you can always comment on, I think, or let me be not too categorical. I think you can generally comment on, probably with nearly any source, is whether or not it was subjected to censorship. So basically, if something was published in South Africa during the period of apartheid, that is 48 to 94, it was probably subjected to quite serious state censorship, especially actually, to be honest, after 1956. I think it was the Customs Act. You'll have to check your notes on the legislation. I'm pretty sure that's right. They introduced a board of state censors and so on. But basically, anything during the apartheid period is likely to have been subjected to quite strict and heavy state censorship. So straight away, just by knowing when and where it was produced, you can make a comment on that. This was published in 1998, so it was after apartheid. So it was probably, I'm going to put here, free from censorship. Okay, and anything published outside South Africa, well, you can't guarantee something published outside South Africa is free from censorship, but it was certainly free from censorship by the South African government. Okay, so that's what I've written there. Free from censorship, 1998. So that's good. I'm going to put a tick. That makes it more reliable. However, I'm going to put a cross as well, because he's writing with the benefit of hindsight. By 1998, it was clear that apartheid had ended by then. It was generally seen. Apartheid was generally seen as an abomination, and its ending was seen as a good thing. So he's going to want to present himself on the right side of history. So I'm going to put the benefit of hindsight. He might want to perhaps make out that everything he did was always aimed at ending apartheid, when that's not necessarily the case. So just something to bear in mind. Okay. Now, obviously, you're probably thinking, blimey, we're nearly 20 minutes into the video, and all I've done is underlined a few things on the first sentence about the source. I haven't even started looking at the sources. Obviously, you'd be doing all of this much quicker because I'm talking through all of these points as I go along. It's much slower, but you'd be just like, oh, de Klerk, okay, tick, informed, whatever. You might not necessarily even need to make these notes here. You might just underline, tick, or cross. You're going to have to be doing this quickly, and again, that's why have a look at as many of these past questions as you can before the exam, so you get in the habit of just you know what you're looking for, underline, tick, cross, a few notes, boom. You need to do it quickly. Even though I said spend time on it, still maximum of about 5 or 7 minutes or so per source. So you're going to have to do it quickly. Don't worry that we're taking long here. But you'll need to do it quicker than this. Sorry. Here he is recalling the speech that he made to the South African Parliament on the 2nd of February 1990. Okay, so he's directly recalling events of the period. Remember, the question asked us about his role in 1990. So directly recalling events of the period, and that's going to be a tick. That makes it particularly useful for a historian, in which he announced his decision. I'm going to underline his, actually. It was his decision. That's interesting, isn't it? As state president, he had a lot of power. It wasn't, necessarily the decision of the parliament or even the party as a whole, although no doubt he would have had discussions, but it was within his power as an individual, as president, to make that decision. So that suggests if he's making this decision to do what? Let's come back to this point. To unban opposition groups and free Nelson Mandela. Well, those are big reforms, right? And they were his reforms, his personal reforms. So straight away, again, that tells us, okay, that yes, he was significant. He was significant because he made this decision, which was a big deal, to unban the ANC and South African Communist Party and so on after 30 years. They were banned in 1960. Well, the Communist Party was banned in 1950, wasn't it? So after 40 years, he unbanned them, and after 30 years, unbanned the PAC and ANC. And remember, unbanned them whilst they were still engaged in a quite ferocious campaign of armed struggle against his government. So that is quite a momentous thing to do. I mean, I don't want to make this parallel as an objective thing, but if you imagine, for a lot of Afrikaners would have considered that like someone unbanning Al-Qaeda or something. Remember, ANC had been demonized as a terrorist force for decades. So to suddenly unban them whilst they were still waging this people's war, that was a momentous thing to do, and it was his decision. So, okay, so already we know, we've been told something that does suggest that he was quite significant. Now let's go to the content of the source. Okay. I awoke with a sense of destiny. Well, that already straight away, I'm going to put a tick. I'm kind of muddling up a bit, aren't I? My ticks and crosses. Some of my ticks meant the source is useful. Now, when I go more into the content, and I already started that here, I'm going to give a tick for anything that suggests that de Klerk was significant. Okay? So, yes. So, sense of destiny, that's a suggestion of this was a very important, significant thing that he was going to do. I knew that my speech would begin a new era. Again, that suggests something very important, momentous, and so on. So again, another tick. Now I'm going to doubly code. So here's the coding. So I'm going to put a first tick to show whether or not it's suggesting de Klerk was important. That's the focus of our whole study here. But then I'm going to give another tick or cross, or maybe both. Here I'm going to assess, is that true? Using my own knowledge, is it true that he was beginning a new era? So tick, it suggests he's important, and then another tick that to say, yeah, that was true. It was important. These were key reforms, right? And we can discuss again. I've made some of the points. Communist Party banned for 40 years, ANC and PAC for 30 years. So this was a big deal. This was important. It was a big step. And in hindsight, we can see it as a first step. I'm going to just write hindsight, first step on the road to ending apartheid. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's what it was intended as at the time. So I'm going to give a cross here as well. And don't worry about, in a way, contradictions are your friend here. Sometimes people think, oh no, is this true or not? Well, it sort of is, but it sort of isn't. What should I put? Contradictions are your friend. Put both. Yeah. To an extent, this is true. These were key reforms. They changed the whole trajectory of criminalizing opposition, that began in the 50s. And in hindsight can be seen as a first step towards the ending of apartheid. However, it's not entirely honest, I would argue, to say, oh, this was this new era and so on, because there was still, he was actually, de Klerk at this point was not committed to ending apartheid. If you think about it, these groups were banned. Mandela was arrested in 1963. He was sentenced to life sentence in 1964. ANC and PAC were banned in 1960, but apartheid started in 1948. So just unbanning opposition groups and freeing Mandela, that's not ending apartheid. So all the apartheid laws at this point, they were all still in place at this point. He did rescind some of them later on, but at this point, all the apartheid laws were still in place. Most of the big, some of the petty apartheid laws he removed that year. Most of the grand apartheid measures he did not end until 92, and some of them not even until the ANC came to power in 94. For example, the separate homeland governments were only abolished after the ANC came to power. So all apartheid laws were still in place. The fact that he'd unbanned opposition groups doesn't necessarily mean that that's part of dismantling apartheid. In hindsight, we can see it as a first step. But its significance in its own right perhaps is being exaggerated a little bit here. Okay, let's carry on. So, I could not be sure of the success of my government's initiative. The test would be the reaction of the media, the leaders whom we wanted to involve in negotiations, the international community, and the public. I'm just going to note, I'm going to underline this. The test would be the reaction of the media, I think, and of the international community. That's quite revealing in relation to the point we just made, because arguably the success of his initiative, the test of the success would be how the international community and the media reacted, as well as those who want to negotiate with and the public. But for me, this suggests really what he's trying to do with this is, remember, South Africa's isolated. It's lost the US as a trading partner since 1986. These tough sanctions which are ruining the South African economy. He's trying to present, no, we've changed, we're different. You know, you can lift your sanctions. You know, you can give us positive coverage now. We're different. Look, Mandela's, you've been saying free Mandela. Look, he's free. So he's not necessarily, the aim of this is not necessarily at the time a first step to end apartheid, but actually a symbolic act to try to reduce South Africa's isolation. So that kind of feeds into this idea. Is he exaggerating the importance of this? And was he doing that at the time as well? And this wasn't really part of ending apartheid. It was part of sustaining apartheid and winning back popular support to enable white supremacy and apartheid to be maintained for longer. Okay. Right, let's have a look. Half my speech will be in English and half in Afrikaans. But I decided to make the announcements that I knew would have the greatest local and foreign impact in English. Again, he's looking for foreign impact, even to the extent where half his talk is delivered in English. Now, that's not only for international audiences. Remember, the white population in South Africa itself is divided into Afrikaner-speaking, the Afrikaans population, and then the English-speaking population. So it's to a domestic audience as well that he's speaking. But I definitely think, and he admits, that it's also about foreign impact. So again, is this... I'm going to put then across here to suggest, well, this is not about dismantling apartheid. This is about trying to reduce South Africa's isolation. This is trying to win back foreign support, win back the support of the US, rather than some kind of big first step to ending apartheid. Okay. When I made the most important announcements in the speech, there was clear support and excitement from the ranks of the National Party, the Democratic Party, and the members of the coloured and Indian chambers. Remember, the coloured and Indian houses were in separate chambers of the House. It was a tri-cameral, three-chamber parliament, one for whites, one for coloureds, one for Indians. Africans had no representation because they were supposed to be represented separately in their homeland governments. Okay, so clear support. Remember, if you're quoting from the source, you don't have to write the whole quote. You can miss some bits out and just put ... You can write clear support ... from the National Party, the Democratic Party, and coloured and Indian chambers. Okay, so now does that suggest he's significant, he's important, that his role was important or not? Well, there's two ways to interpret this. I think in a way it could be, you could say, well, yeah, this suggests he was important because he was able to win over all of that support, even from other parties. So that shows what an important man he was, right? He was able to win all that support from other parties. But it also, you could say, well, if there was that much support for these measures, it suggests there's probably a lot of pressure already for those measures to be taken. And any leader, if it was someone else, would have probably taken the same path. Well, let's say not any. Let's be a slightly more nuanced. An other leader, and again, we're going to be nuanced, may have taken a similar path. Given that these were so popular, then another leader might have taken a similar path. Okay. I'd achieved my objectives of convincing both friends and foes. Again, so friends here, I think in many ways, not only, but in many ways he's talking about the US, but he's also talking about white people, you know, who were terrified of Mandela and the ANC. He needed to convince them that this was an okay move to do. But particularly, I think he's also talking about the USA, Britain, and so on. Convincing friends and foes, so he's talking about the ANC himself and so on, that the National Party had made a fundamental policy shift. And again, this all for me convincing. Yeah, he wants to convince people that this was already a fundamental policy shift. Yeah. So again, I'm gonna so there he's I give a tick here because he's saying he's presenting himself as significant. He's convinced all these people, but actually there is another side to that. Yeah, so he's significant, but is it dismantling apartheid, or is he just trying to present a different image to the world? Yeah, is it about presenting a different image to win people over? Okay, so so we can make both of those points. Yeah, and that's good. Like I say, don't think, oh no, I'm contradicting myself. You're not. You're just pointing out there are different ways to interpret this. And if you can bring both those different ways to bear in your analysis, that's good. You're going to get rewarded with marks for doing that, right? You're not going to be marked down for being indecisive. Okay. The one matter that had raised the greatest expectations and that I had deliberately played down in my speech was the release of Nelson Mandela. It was crucially important. The fundamental decisions, again, you know, think about the language. He's suggesting these are fundamental decisions, really important. We had taken should not be overshadowed by an announcement on Mandela's release. During my first meetings with Mandela after his release, we accepted one another's integrity. So again, if you think about it, he's saying that this is he's saying he personally had this big role and he was able to win over Mandela, begin the process of negotiations that led to the end of apartheid, right? Slightly out of focus there, isn't it? Is that better? So he's saying he's significant. I question this, actually. I question the accuracy of this because we know, so then I'm going to put across. So the first tick, he's suggesting that he's important. But then across for my evaluation of that claim, that Mandela accepted his integrity, I'm questioning that. I'm put across. I don't think that's true because we know that Mandela, in the start of the CODESA negotiations, if you remember, publicly lambasted de Klerk, specifically for being a man without integrity. He felt he'd been lied to by de Klerk. Remember the Encarta scandal that broke later? That they'd always had suspicions anyway, but it kind of came out. There was evidence that the security forces under de Klerk were actually sponsoring, training, arming Inkatha Freedom Party, Chief Buthelez's Inkatha Freedom Party, to actually massacre ANC supporters in ANC strongholds. That was happening, and then a kind of smoking gun was revealed linking the security services to those massacres. And so, and at one point Mandela even cut off negotiations, saying de Klerk is dishonest. You know, he's making out that he's negotiating, but he's actually sponsoring, you know, attacks against us and so on. So, okay. We realized that we both bore the responsibility for ensuring there would be a negotiated settlement, and we were both committed to carrying it out. Okay, so again, both bore the responsibility for a negotiated settlement. He's suggesting that he is significant. Him and just one other man, basically, the weight of the country was on their shoulders. The future of the country is on their shoulders. So he's suggesting he's significant, and in many ways I think that is accurate, isn't it? The course of those negotiations did determine the future of the country, so I think that's fairly accurate. So okay, so I like the rule of three. I like sort of making 3 points and fleshing them out. So if we can kind of sum up really what's de Klerk's own answer to that question of how important was he in the process of dismantling apartheid in 1990, he would obviously say very important. very important. For three main reasons you can kind of discern from here, I think. So first, that he made these fundamental decisions, this decision to unban the parties, release Nelson Mandela and so on, made fundamental decisions that kind of ultimately led to the end of apartheid, or the first step towards the end of apartheid. That's his first claim, if you like, about his own importance. Secondly, and relating to that, he was able to convince others to go along with those changes, which obviously was necessary and important, and that was he had this personal role in convincing others from his own party, in particular, but also others from other parties to go along with this reform program, and finally that he was able to win the trust of Mandela, leading to negotiations. These are really the three claims we can discern, or inferences we can draw from this about the ways in which he was important in the process of dismantling apartheid. Okay, so much for source 3. Let's have a look at source 4. Okay. Sorry, it's quite long, isn't it? Like I say, you're going to have to do this all super quick. But I just wanted to introduce you to this technique, I suppose, where you're annotating the document, underlining key points that shed light on the clerk's importance, and then making some little notes to yourself, using kind of ticks or crosses to show if these are things that suggest he was or wasn't important, and then follow up ticks or crosses to say, well, are these claims true or not? Okay, source 4, from Hugo Young, Frontiers of a New Land, published 1990. So again, it's from the date that we're looking at, so that makes it useful. He's directly recounting events at the time in this case. He's actually writing at the time, so it's not tainted by hindsight. He's writing what he saw at the time that we're talking about. So unlike de Klerk, writing in 1998, Hugo Young doesn't know that these reforms are going to end apartheid. He doesn't know that. So maybe there's sort of a less of an inevitability about, oh, this was obviously the first step to end apartheid. That wasn't necessarily clear at the time. Okay, Young was a journalist for a left-leaning British newspaper, so it was British. So again, not subject to South African censors, not censored. Britain does have its own process of censorship and so on, but not censored by the South African authorities, at least, so likely to be a little bit more free in what he writes than a South African journalist would have been at the time. It's left-leaning, left-wing, to cut a long story short, really is all about equality of all humans, so obviously including racial equality, so obviously left-wingers are sort of inherently going to object to things like apartheid, because that's obviously founded on the basic principle of racial inequality. So we can deduce already that its left-leaning newspaper is probably going to be hostile to apartheid. It's probably going to be sympathetic to the anti-apartheid forces. None of that necessarily at this point tells us anything about what it's going to say about de Klerk's significance, but it may be a little bit wary of him as the leader of National Party in a still apartheid state. From the Guardian, okay, Guardian is a kind of, well, it says left-leaning, I'd call it liberal newspaper. He wrote this report following a visit to South Africa. Okay, so again, it's going to be well informed about what's happening on the ground. He's got direct experience of how these measures went down in South Africa. Direct experience on the ground, that's a plus. That makes the source useful. 3 months after Mandela was released, so he's there pretty soon after these, and he's able to assess their impact on the ground a little bit directly, people how they felt about them and so on. Okay, so again, you can see straight away from what both sources actually are, they're going to be useful. Yeah, they're going to be useful. Whatever they say, they're going to show us how these people interpreted these events at the time. Okay. I was sceptical of British claims that a meeting between President de Klerk and Mrs. Thatcher, if we don't know who Mrs. Thatcher is, we put a little footnote, Mrs. Thatcher is the British Prime Minister at the time, in June 1989 was of crucial importance. A week in South Africa showed me its importance. Thatcher explained to de Klerk that she couldn't keep up her anti-sanctions position forever. Now, here we need some historical context. Remember that the key allies had been of South Africa, the apartheid regime in South Africa had always been the US and Britain, and to a certain extent Israel. But 1986, this momentous year when the US Congress voted to put sanctions, quite comprehensive sanctions, on South Africa. So basically from 86, South Africa lost the USA as a trading partner. Now, Britain stayed committed to supporting the apartheid regime under Thatcher and resisted sanctions. There was a big movement calling for sanctions on South Africa, and the US was sanctioning South Africa, but Mrs. Thatcher was standing firm against that. She was saying, no, we're going to keep South Africa as a trading partner. She didn't justify this, by the way, you should know, by saying, white supremacy is great and we support them forever. She justified it by saying, if we're trading with them, then we've got kind of influence and we can influence them to be more kinder and more reformist and so on. So she wasn't explicitly justifying apartheid, but she was saying that the way to produce change in South Africa is by engaging rather than by isolating them. But here we go. Thatcher explained to de Klerk she couldn't keep up her anti-sanctions position forever. Okay, interesting. Unless there was some reform, South African society would only be sustainable using armed force. So I think really for me, well, pause the video. What do you think? Do you think what he's saying here suggests that de Klerk was important or wasn't important, what we've seen so far? I'm going to suggest that this kind of undermines the idea that de Klerk was so important, because what it points to is kind of inescapable pressures that any leader would have been subjected to, right? So, there's all this pressure. His one remaining ally, it looks like she's on the verge. She's saying, look, I might have to sanction you as well. I'm completely out of step now with the USA, completely out of step with world opinion. Everyone thinks you're outrageous. I can't keep supporting you forever. So there's this pressure. He's going to lose his last major ally unless he reforms. Now that pressure would be there whether it was de Klerk, whether it be Botha, whoever it was, right? So that's suggesting maybe him as an individual wasn't so important. What was more important was this structural pressure on South Africa that would have led to the same or similar policies from whoever was in charge. Okay. However, look at the last sentence. De Klerk had the courage and intelligence to get the message. So again, actually, so here he's saying actually it was important because, so here, let's give a tick. It was important that it was de Klerk because even though there were these pressures, someone like Botha might have tried to just stand firm forever. Might have done. So he's nuanced here. He's saying, yeah, there's these pressures, would have acted on any leader, but it's to de Klerk's credit, he did get the message, and he then introduced his reforms and so on. Okay, de Klerk's shift in policy has not been a vast political risk, and again, this sort of undermines the idea that he was so important. He presents himself like, it's destiny, this new era. I didn't know how it was going to go down, but I was so good, I won everyone over. He said it wasn't really a big risk. He says it has its white supporters. So again, if there was already this push to move in this direction, even in the white community, that suggests that other leaders may well have taken the same path again. Moving to end apartheid is a relief to a lot of modern Afrikaner politicians who are now prepared to confess they've been unhappy with it for years. So again, that's it suggests it's not just him. Anyone would have probably gone down the same path. And if we want to just, again, verify the accuracy of some of this, it has its white supporters. That's true. So remember, my first tick or cross is to say whether or not de Klerk was significant. My second one is to say whether or not the claim being made is true. So I'm saying it's true that it has its white supporters. Remember, there was that referendum. 62% of whites in 1992 supported the reforms and the negotiations and so on. So that kind of backs up his claim that this wasn't such a big risk. It had white support, etc. Okay. De Klerk has finally wiped out the ideology of white supremacy. That's quite a claim. And of course, that is something that suggests de Klerk was very significant in dismantling apartheid. He's actually himself personally wiped out the whole ideology underpinning apartheid. So tick to show, well, that suggests, we can infer from that, Hugo Young is saying de Klerk was significant. However, I'm going to put a big cross in terms of, I don't think that's true. I don't think he's wiped out the ideology of white supremacy. You still had the Conservative Party, who, remember, became the second biggest party in Parliament in 1987. They were kind of gnashing at his ankles. You know, they were still committed to white supremacy. You had this paramilitary formation, the AWB, under Eugene Terreblanche. These groups could still have been what we call spoilers, you know, people who came along to disrupt the negotiations and so on. And they did try. If you remember the AWB, I think it was 1993, actually smashed through into the World Trade Center, was it? The World Trade Center building in South Africa, where the negotiations were being held. And for a moment, things were on a knife edge as well. Conservative Party politicians sponsored the assassination of Chris Hani, perhaps the most, or at least second most popular figure in the ANC in 1993. Things really were on a knife edge then. And it looked like these guys could have acted as spoilers to the whole thing. So white supremacy was alive and well amongst the white population in these forces. It wasn't necessarily the dominant force anymore, but it was still a significant player. I think to say the whole ideology has been wiped out is a bit premature. Some people would even say economic apartheid still exists even today and is justified in some measure by white supremacist thinking. If you look at John Pilger's excellent documentary Apartheid Did Not Die, he goes into that. And even de Klerk himself, in the CODESA negotiations, if you remember, was pressing for basically a white veto on any future post-apartheid policy. He said anything that happens, there should be a coalition government, and he called it minority rights for the white minority, and that anything would have to be agreed by both blacks and whites. So basically anything the whites didn't agree to, even though they're only, whatever it is, 10-15% of the population, that they could block. So I think that's a bit overblown to say he'd wiped out the ideology of white supremacy. He does then nuance it a bit. He says some people are naive enough to think this automatically means the agreed end of white domination. That's far from certain. And again, so here, now this is interesting. We go back to our original thing. De Klerk's importance in dismantling apartheid. He's saying, well, actually, de Klerk isn't necessarily going to bring about the end of white domination. So that's kind of undermining. That's suggesting, no, de Klerk this isn't necessarily this big move in dismantling apartheid. And I think that's true. He is still committed to, he's not committed, for example, at this point, and this is one of the big sticking points in the negotiations, not committed to OPOV, one person, one vote, where just there's total, your race doesn't affect your citizenship at all, everyone's just equal, has the same vote, and whichever party wins, they become the government. That's OPOV, one person, one vote. And de Klerk held out against that right until near to the end, until the very last year of apartheid. He was holding out against that and still insisting, as I said, on this white veto. Okay, de Klerk says that constitutional apartheid will soon be entirely eliminated. Okay, so that obviously suggests he was important in dismantling apartheid. my reporting shows that actual apartheid, petty or grand, is far from gone. And that shows you that's the limit on de Klerk's significance. And I think that's true. We can illustrate that by the fact that, you know, some of the key apartheid laws, that the Native Land Act, the Group Areas Act, and so on, were still in place at this point. My promises about the laws, the promises about the laws remain to be fulfilled in practice. So that's important as well. In 1990, there's promises to end laws, but they haven't been yet ended. So again, that's sort of, if we're saying de Klerk was important, dismantling apartheid in 1990, that's a limitation on that. However, this modest start with little given away has already done a lot for South Africa's image. Its status as an outcast nation is ending. Okay, so so what can we say about that? It's done a lot, so that suggests a certain significance. But the significance is more winning international opinion rather than necessarily dismantling apartheid. Okay. All right, and a modest start with little given away does suggest, at this point, it wasn't so significant what de Klerk was doing yet. Okay. All right, so again, if we can kind of try and break this down, again, I like the sort of rule of three. What three things could we... And pause the video, maybe do this yourself first before you see what I come up with. If you could break this down, 3 key points that Hugo Young's saying that tell us something about whether or not de Klerk was really important in dismantling apartheid. Okay, so I would say first thing he's saying he's taken an important first step. A modest, important but modest first step. Modest means not so massive, but it's important. Okay, that's his first kind of claim about de Klerk's importance here. However, apartheid remains, and it was taken under pressure. These points were taken under pressure. These moves were taken under pressure. So therefore, they're not necessarily all of de Klerk's, from within his own will. He's just reacting to various external pressures that any leader would have had to have reacted to. Okay, so then when we come to structure, remember we're using these sources together. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to see where can we find links, but we don't want to just write about one source and then write about the other source, because then we're not really using them together. We want to sort of compare the sources as we go along. So let's have a look. Are there any points that either the one source makes that either support the points made in the other source or that kind of contradict it? So let's have a look at these 3. So de Klerk thinks he made fundamental decisions that led to the end of apartheid, and Hugo Young agrees that he's taken an important but modest first step. So we can link points 1 and 1 on both sides. We can write them together. That can be our first paragraph, where we can say, well, both sources agree that he's taken an important first step. Obviously, there's a nuance. Hugo Young thinks they're less important than de Klerk's making out, but they both agree that this move was important. Okay. However, apartheid remains in place, so that's a kind of limit there. We might bring that into that paragraph. And this point, he said, he was able to convince others and win the trust of Mandela. But actually, these reforms were taken under pressure. So we might be able to kind of draw a link between how there's a kind of contrast there isn't there? Where de Klerk's highlighting his own individual importance, winning people's trust, where here he's saying, well, they were kind of taken under pressure. Okay, let's have a look then. And then, so when it comes to writing it up, I'd suggest really a three-part essay. So I would have an introduction where you talk about the provenance, what is useful about what the sources are, who wrote them, when, and so on. Kind of get those points done and out of the way. Where you do these doesn't matter. It's just, for me, it kind of makes sense to introduce the sources by saying what they are, who wrote them, and why that's important. Then you have what I would suggest your kind of three-part main body, make 3 different points, and in each paragraph you're taking quotes and drawing inferences from both sources as you go along, and then a kind of summary conclusion of how you would use these sources together, what are each of them mainly useful for, and so on. Okay, I'm going to show you one I prepared earlier in relation to this. Unfortunately, I'm not sure I can post this on the channel, so I'm just going to have to read it out to you here. So here we go. Both sources are extremely useful to a historian investigating de Klerk's importance in dismantling apartheid in 1990. And again, like I say, probably your first sentence could always begin like that if you want, because they're only going to give you useful sources for the topic that they're talking about. They're both extremely useful, whether using the criteria of providing factually accurate content relating to de Klerk's importance, or of how de Klerk and others interpreted and sought to present his importance. Remember, there's sort of 2 levels that you can consider the usefulness of a source. Does it provide factually accurate content? But also, even if it doesn't, it can still be useful for showing you how different people interpreted it and sought to present that issue. Source 3, written by de Klerk himself, will clearly be very well informed about his own role in the events described, and shows us exactly how he sought to present this role to a post-apartheid audience. So I'm just writing up here the points we made when we looked at the description of the sources. Published in 1998, the events will still have been relatively fresh in his mind, and he's reflecting on what are widely regarded as his first significant moves towards dismantling the apartheid system. Source 4, meanwhile, from The Guardian, shows us how these moves were interpreted and presented at the time by British liberals. The author is also likely to be well informed, having spent time in South Africa in the aftermath of Mandela's release, as well as being a professional journalist, likely to have undergone rigorous training and have access to multiple reliable sources. Publishing in Britain, he would also be free from the South African censors, as well as free from fear of repercussions from the South African security services. That's again something else that even people writing outside, say the ANC in exile, writing outside South Africa, some of them might have still had family in South Africa during apartheid, who they might be worried if they write something too condemnatory of South Africa, then their family members might be at risk. Okay, but that's all irrelevant here because he's not living there, he doesn't have family there, etc. Allowing him to present an honest and untainted account of de Klerk's position. So that's about what makes the sources useful, how they can be used in terms of what they are. Now, what about what they say? Okay, both sources agree that de Klerk's moves to unban the ANC and PAC, I should have put the Communist Party as well there, and to release several high-level political prisoners, including Mandela, were highly significant. Source 3 claims that the announcement began, quote, a new era and represented, quote, a fundamental policy shift. So you see here, I'm just using little quotes. You don't need to quote huge entire sentences and stuff. Just use little quotes, little phrases to illustrate what the sources are saying. While Source 4 claimed that de Klerk, quote, has finally wiped out the ideology of white supremacy. So I picked the quotes that from both of them that show they both believe this was really important. De Klerk's reforms are really important. In hindsight, the announcement can indeed be seen as the first step towards dismantling apartheid, followed as it was by the repeal of key apartheid laws such as the Group Areas Act and the Population Registration Act later that year, the CODESA negotiations, and ultimately in the enfranchisement of the black population in 1994, marking the decisive end of the apartheid era. So again, bringing in some own knowledge here to show, yeah, in hindsight, this was a first step, and here's the things that came later that ended apartheid. However, this outcome was not necessarily de Klerk's intention, and certainly his initial reforms did not represent the wiping out of white supremacy. Important sections of South Africa remained committed to white supremacy and apartheid, including the Conservative Party, as acknowledged by de Klerk in the source. Remember, he said everyone, his speech went down very well with everyone basically except the Conservative Party, who were the biggest opposition party in Parliament by the late 80s, as well as by the well-armed paramilitary party Eugene Terreblanche's AWB. But even de Klerk himself was not fully reconciled to black majority rule in 1990, and for several years continued to hold out against one person, one vote, advocating instead a racialized power-sharing system in which white politicians would maintain a veto over policy, while simultaneously funding terror attacks against ANC supporters in an attempt to undermine their position in negotiations, as revealed in the Inkatha scandal. So I'm questioning this idea of, this was his brave de Klerk beginning to dismantle apartheid. Well, was he doing that? Or was he playing a different game at that time? Clearly, de Klerk seems to be rewriting history to a degree, painting what was probably intended as a cunning publicity stunt for an international audience as a genuine first step towards total racial equality. So you can see what I've done in that paragraph. I've used quotes from both sources, and really the way I'd lay out the main body, each paragraph as well, it's sort of, start with a quote, and then draw an inference from that quote, or I've done it the other way around here. I've done the inference, which is that de Klerk was important because his reforms were significant. I've then done quotes from both sources to illustrate that, and then I've assessed those claims using my own knowledge. Okay. Next point. Source 4 is more honest about de Klerk's importance as an individual, noting both the pressures he was under and the limited impact of his initial reforms. Hugo Young's recall of Thatcher's comment to de Klerk that she, quote, couldn't keep up her anti-sanctions position forever, shows that de Klerk was facing the loss of his last major ally, Britain, if he did not countenance serious reform. This suggests that any leader in his position would likely have been forced into a similar course, undermining the importance of his own personal role, although Young does credit him for having, quote, the courage and intelligence to get the message, where perhaps someone like Botha may not have done. Nevertheless, the suggestion that another leader in the same position would have taken broadly similar actions seems reasonable. So here I'm assessing the claim, right? I've drawn the inference, which is that, well, he was under all this pressure. So the inference is he wasn't that important as an individual, because actually any other leader would have been under the same pressure and would have had to take a similar course. That's the inference I've drawn, and now I'm assessing that claim. Okay? So I've said it seems reasonable, given that South Africa had lost its most important ally in 1986, when the US Congress voted for comprehensive sanctions, whilst most of the rest of the world, Britain and Israel being key exceptions, had been hostile to apartheid since the 1960s. So I'm using my own knowledge to assess the claim that I've inferred from the source, which is that de Klerk wasn't that important as an individual because actually these structural pressures would have led to similar reforms from any leader. I'm assessing that by saying, yeah, there were these pressures. They lost the US as a trading partner in 1986, etc. So I'm bringing my own knowledge to sort of validate that claim being made. Okay, this isolation was having a devastating effect on the South African economy, with the rand losing half its value in the mid-80s, further incentivizing widespread riots, undermining stability still further. Young actually suggests that the real significance of de Klerk's reforms was not so much that they helped dismantle apartheid, and I've got the quote, actual apartheid, petty or grand, is far from gone, but that they helped win over international support and began to rehabilitate South Africa's international reputation, again illustrated by his quote, having, quote, already done a lot for South Africa's image. To be fair, de Klerk himself does acknowledge this when he notes that, quote, the test would be the reaction of, and I've missed out some of the quote, showing that by ... the international community, amongst others. So you see, with each paragraph, I'm kind of drawing an inference, and then I'm using both sources to show how they have slightly different position, or sometimes the same position, on that issue. So the first paragraph is, look, the changes were significant, both the sources claim that, and here's some evidence to back that up, although here's also some reason why we should be wary as well of how important and significant they were at that time. The second point being made is that actually there was all these pressures, and so really, de Klerk as a personal individual maybe wasn't so important as anyone would have to react to those pressures. And again, I've used quotes from both sources that could kind of lead to that inference. Okay, so the last point I make, furthermore, both sources suggest that de Klerk's personal importance was limited by the fact that the course he took was already being sought by a majority of whites and was dependent on others. So whilst they said he's limited because of the pressures, now he's limited because actually he's dependent on other people. What he was looking for was already popular amongst whites, etc. Source 4 acknowledges this openly, noting that, quote, his shift in policy has not been a vast political risk, and that it, quote, has its white supporters. While source 3 also references, quote, clear support from the National Party and the Democratic Party. So when you're going through the text, kind of look for either where the places where the sources are saying something similar, and then you can address those points together in the same paragraph, or where they're saying something directly opposite, where again you can address them in the same paragraph. You can say, whereas source 3 says this, source 4 says the opposite. In this case, they're both admitting, they're both saying that there are supporters from across the white population, basically. And the inference we draw from that is that maybe de Klerk as an individual wasn't so popular. This was already a policy that had supporters and was being pushed. This suggests, as with the external pressures, that any leader in his position would likely have taken similar steps, as it was what the majority of white opinion called for. And remember, at this time, white opinion was particularly important because it was only white people who could vote. This is evidenced by the all-white referendum held on de Klerk's reforms in 1992, in which 62% voted in favour of continued reforms and a negotiated end to apartheid. De Klerk's reference to him and Mandela jointly bearing, quote, the responsibility for a, quote, negotiated settlement, likewise limits de Klerk's personal responsibility for dismantling apartheid, as it accepts it was dependent on Mandela's cooperation. His claim that, quote, we accepted one another's integrity, however, inflating his own importance by presenting himself as someone uniquely able to win Mandela's trust, is demonstrably false. So here again I'm assessing the claims being made with my own knowledge. The opening of CODESA saw Mandela specifically question de Klerk's integrity, and his trust was further undermined by the Gate revelations. So, yeah, and by the way, I just want to say at this point, this is more than you would be, I acknowledge, this is more than you'd be able to write in, realistically, you've only got about half an hour to write it, right? After you spent 10, 15 minutes going through the sources. I accept it's more than you'd be able to write, so even if you just made some of these points, you could still get full marks. What I'm doing here, I suppose, and the reason I didn't deliberately cut it short, is that I wanted to show you just how much you can get out of these sources. You can get more than you're going to have time to write. And that's okay. You don't need to make every point in order to get full marks. Like I say, if you can pick sort of 3 areas that both sources address and write something about each of the 3, bringing in some quotes from both sources in each case, and with some of your own knowledge to assess the claims, that's great. That's amazing already. Yeah. You don't need to, I waffled on a bit, right, to make the point. You won't have time to do that, and that's fine. In summary, I think this is kind of the icing on the cake. I would say compared to a normal, like, non-source essay, and a non-source essay, a conclusion is really important because it's your line of argument. I'd say it's less important to have a sort of summary conclusion in the source question. It's more important to spend your time doing that key work of drawing out inferences from the source about the topic, and then evaluating the claims made. That's the way you want to spend most of your time. But if you can put a little summary that just provides a short, snappy answer to that basic question of how far could the historian use these sources together to investigate de Klerk's role in dismantling apartheid in 1990. You can make just a couple of sentences to kind of really bring that all together. That's good. So I've put, in summary, the sources are useful to a historian of this topic in a variety of ways. And again, any summary could start with that opening sentence because they're always going to be useful in several ways. Source 3 shows how de Klerk sought to present his own role in ending apartheid to a post-apartheid audience, inflating his own importance, misconstruing his uneasy relationship with Mandela, and downplaying the role of external pressure. I've maybe been a bit harsh on him there, but I think it's all true. Source 4 shows how British Liberals saw his reforms as an important first step, albeit one taken under pressure, and credited him for it. So I've showed how each source is useful, highlighting a different aspect, and now taken together, the sources illuminate the forces supporting and opposing the ending of apartheid. illustrate how de Klerk's reforms were largely accepted by many white South Africans at the time, and highlight de Klerk's dependence on Mandela and on foreign support to achieve his reforms. All of this helps build a nuanced picture of de Klerk's importance in dismantling apartheid in 1990. So, like I say, the sources, they're always going to be useful. You can have a couple of sentences at the end, just really picking out exactly what makes them useful, what exactly they show, what different areas of the topic they shed light on. Then that's useful. That could potentially soak up a few more marks if you can kind of show that you're really honed in on exactly and precisely how they're important and useful. Bloody hell, 1 hour and 10 minutes. Sorry about that. I hope that was useful. Like I say, the best type of revision is just practice, and you don't need to practice necessarily writing the whole essays, although that's useful to do at least a couple of timed essays as well. But I think the most important thing, practice looking at and planning out in detail answers to as many questions, both normal essay questions and source questions, as you can. And that way you'll kind of have a bit of a, because you'll notice the same sorts of questions come up again and again. They'll usually hit you with a bit of a sidewinder sometimes, and you have to really think on the spot, and it won't be as simple as, oh, this is just a version of something I've already looked at. But generally, if you're just in the habit of, oh, this is about the end of apartheid, okay, there's the 3 factors, regional pressure, domestic pressure, international pressure, whatever, and you've kind of just automatically, those memory banks and those structures and factors are just triggered automatically because you've looked at so many similar questions. That's really the position you want to be in when you go into the exam. So good luck, everybody who's got that coming up. Yeah, I'm sure you're going to smash it out of the park. Yes. Okay, all the best.